Hello and welcome to my review of Catwoman, a 2004 movie tie-in with the Oscar bait movie of the same name. The novelisation is by Elizabeth Hand, a Nebula Award winner in her own right, and with all the acclaim that comes with that title these days. As always, a novelisation will be based on a film script, though not always the final one, and sometimes the filming editing process means that there can be some quite large differences between the film and the novelisation. This, though, will be a review purely of the novel because, despite the worldwide acclaim lavished on the film, I haven't actually seen it. So the plot follows the mousy Patience Phillips, a graphic designer with Hedare Beauty, a cosmetics company that's run by the husband and wife duo of George and Laurel Hedare. In pursuit of her big break, Patience is pushing to be the lead designer on a campaign, and she works so hard that she ends up having to rush to hand deliver 15 minutes before midnight her work to the Hedare factory. I'm not quite sure why she didn't go to the head office, which seems to be a different place, but okay. Snooping around factories in the dead of the night is, as we're probably aware in these sort of movies, a pretty good way of ending up as dead as the night. She is, of course, rescued from being dead by cats. She bumps into a do-gooder cop by the name of Tom Lone, and she hangs around with her annoying bestie, Sally. Then she reads a book, which has lots of stories about other women being saved by cats. She starts dressing in leather and being really quite annoying herself. She also, for some reason, starts to bother people at Hedare, even though there's a split personality developing, and if we are to believe that Catwoman has her own methods and motivations distinctly separate from Patience, that as Catwoman's cattiness develops, and by that I mean she becomes more cat-like rather than the snarkiness that's just a byproduct, she would have less reason to involve herself in Patience's business. And Patience, having been fired by Hedare, wouldn't really have that much of a motive to be around those people anyway, aside from her death, which she claims to have amnesia about anyway. But the whole thing rather labours towards a mediocre, unoriginal showdown with a baddie that is awkwardly telegraphed long before it becomes what passes for a twist in the minds of the three dullards responsible for the story here. Which leads impeccably onto the question of who is to blame for the debacle of this book, because this is really quite abysmal, but not having seen the film, I don't know what hand might have slipped in of her own volition and what is the responsibility of Rogers, Ferris and Brancato, the triumvirate of trash. It is clear that none of the four writers involved did a lick of research into any of the factors that the novel skirts over, not the industrial or commercial side of cosmetics, not the sketchy police procedural that drifts in and out of the story with no more impact than an eggy fart, but instead this is just pieces of cliches taken from other unoriginal movies and TV shows and then taped together without really much care. But even a quick Google search could have spared them the embarrassment of their wishes it was witty banter backfiring on them when a jilted Laurel tells her husband he ought to resist the urge to date children born on the same day they invented cell phones. Well, cell phones were invented prior to 1973 because that's when the first cell phone call was made. So some years prior to that, cell phones were invented. But when this book was published or the film made in 2004, anyone born on that day would have been 31 years old. So they probably wouldn't qualify as children. Perhaps there is somewhere a 31-year-old still going through the grade school system, but I would suggest that there's a more serious issue there that it hardly seems worthy of scorn. Who is responsible, too, for the chapters devoted to the asides about the unrelated women also saved by cats? Who decided to place the majority of them in the final third of the novel? Just one of the major issues with the pacing of this story. These painfully dull pseudo-encyclopedia entries offer nothing to the Catwoman canon, but cause some serious road bumps in a novel that seems to have no idea what it's about or why, where it's going or how it's getting there. Surely these flashbacks were cut out of the movie. On the subject of the film, it's an unfortunate side effect of the movie existing that the cover reminds us that Halle Berry played the eponymous Catwoman, so Hand's attempts to position the more outgoing Sally as the better option of the two post-feline intervention anyway becomes somewhat laughable. Can you imagine the casting session where all sat there going, yes, we've got Halle Berry, now all we need to do is cast her better looking friend? Her what now? I'm pretty sure that the better looking than Halle Berry gene pool is a pretty small one. Our three male screenwriters also seem to be promoting some sort of feminist message, with a multimillionaire female CEO of a global cosmetic giant railing against the patriarchy, keeping her down in the final battle. Of course, none of our oh-so-talented three men responsible for these head gymnastics stepped aside for a female scribe to have a go at this. Well, when you're a well-paid man with no discernible talent in the industry, perhaps when the subject of patriarchy arises, you're better off shutting the hell up. But there is some evidence here that Hand might well have been better off without the three saddlebags, not just on her trophy shelf, but just the shining example of the stunningly messy and incompetent story that was provided her. But there's also the odd flash here and there that she can actually write. Aside from a smattering of avoidable repetition, Patience's death scene and an earlier scene where she's clinging to a window frame are both actually quite well done, but they're both near the start of the novel, and it's slim pickings after that. It feels a little bit like Hand started off full of enthusiasm, but she soon ran out of steam, perhaps buried under the sheer avalanche of awful. For an example of the pure awful, the scene where Patience crashes Lone's school visit, where they banter in front of the kids who then disappear from the scene entirely and then return on cue in a way that clearly demonstrates that they are mere movie props and not actual real characters. The cue itself is pure awfulness, with Patience and Lone playing basketball and her smashing the ball up, and then smack down through the hoop once more. They then fool around on the floor for at least 1 minute, which might not sound like much unless you're on a basketball court surrounded by children. Then it sounds like an eternal cringe for all involved. But her effort was enough to send her flying as well. With a muffled oof, she smacked into Tom, and then the two of them tumbled onto the ground, limbs entwined. For an entire minute they lay there, panting as they caught their breath, both with faces sweat-streaked, pulses racing, their hands touching. Patience stared at Tom, he gazed back. Their breathing slowed, became synchronous. Without realizing it, Tom tightened his large hand around Patience's small one. Patience began to feel as though her life was slowing down. Heat suffused her face. She licked her lips, her gaze still locked with Tom's. She slowly began to move, as though to extricate herself from him. Imperceptibly, his grasp upon her hands tightened. He began to draw her towards him, and she slowly moved willingly, albeit unthinkingly. Lips parted, and her tousled hair began to fall across her eyes. "Hey," whispered Tom. "Hey." Mr. Lone," a plaintive voice interrupted him. "Can we have our ball back?" This is the ball, of course, that she just smacked away, literally in that scene. How do they have it again? It's obviously contrived. But these children who were on the court, they're disappearing from all of the scene and coming back like that, it's really, really awkward. It's clear evidence that the screenwriters have literally no idea what they're doing. They're not thinking about what they're doing. It is just cliche after cliche piled on top of each other. And this is what Hand has to work with. She's rather hamstrung from the beginning. But at least these kids involved now have something that they can tell their parents about their school day, I suppose. But the mysterious ball that disappears and reappears again without warning is probably something for a more advanced physics class. Perhaps surprisingly for a novelisation that's based on a movie, or maybe not surprisingly when it's based on a movie with the reputation that this one has, but the dialogue in this book is utterly awful, cliched and cringe-inducing when not simply one or the other. Tom Lone buys Patience candy floss, or cotton candy for the American audience, and then says, "I didn't know anyone over the age of 9 was allowed to eat cotton candy." Then who are you buying it for? No doubt this comes under the excuse of banter, but she's supposed to be the socially awkward one. Banter this stale costs you a second date. But the witty Catwoman costs Patience her job at her dare by calling her boss an untalented, unethical and unappreciative egomaniac. Perhaps buoyed by the sheer serotonin boost from coming up with such a witty insult, she then calls him an ungracious, untalented, unappreciative egomaniac. And that's a variety of snappy put-downs so richly diverse that just thinking them up was a 3-man job. Post-feline transformation, and I believe the book calls it phylogeny, Patience, Catwoman, seems to be trying to give Sally some competition for her position as the book's most annoying character. She simply won't shut up, seemingly unable to think of anything witty for their protagonist to say. The 4 people responsible for getting this through a screenplay and then into a novel, make her quip at everything, because quantity is much better than quality. But it doesn't matter whether this event is incredibly mundane or tedious. Catwoman has to have something to say about it, and not any of those things are remotely interesting. When the cat's away, the mice will dance. Leatherette, honey, it looks so cheap. You should always splurge for the real thing. Somewhat undercut by the cover here. Then a police sketch artist of the suspect, who is Patience, popped up, a masked woman with the penetrating eyes and pitiless expression of a psychopath. Patience blanched. Talk about having a bad hair day, she thought in chagrin. Is your girl perfect like me? Some scenes, this is literally every 3 or 4 lines she has to have something to say, and none of them rise above this quality. This is a small sample of a large body of evidence. Patience might have been better served by just keeping quiet for once, because if you can't write banter or can't be bothered, then your heroine might be more effective as the strong and silent type. But then if any of the writers could exercise any sort of self-reflection or control, then this story wouldn't exist in the first place. And I must ask that if your backstory for your heroine is that she's a mousy, low-level corporate employee who finds out something about her boss that perhaps she shouldn't know and then is killed for having that knowledge, why isn't your character called Selina Kyle? Because I know that we talk a little bit and people can be, or they can certainly have some strong feelings about race swapping of existing characters. But nobody really cares about Samuel L. Jackson being Nick Fury, because Samuel L. Jackson is clearly the best person for the role. But when you have Halle Berry in the early 2000s coming off an Oscar win, sort of riding high, I know the James Bond film that she was in was not brilliant, but it sort of added to her star power. She was at the height of her career. To say that Halle Berry is going to play Selina Kyle, particularly, we're talking about 16 years ago as well, I don't think anyone would have batted an eyelid other than to go, cool. So why have they invented Patience but given her the exact same story? Is Patience an existing DC Catwoman part of that canon? I don't really know. But it just seems to me that there's no reason for this. She just could. Why is she not Selina Kyle? The backstory is the same. So I will return to the novel, because I think that the decision, whether it's Selina or Patience, was taken at a movie level. But I think that Elizabeth Hand was hamstrung by having to work with seriously flawed, unoriginal, cliche drivel that's trying to pass itself off as a movie script. She seemed to have neither the power, the will, or perhaps even the talent to write herself out of that pretty deep hole. Though I have to say that may not have been possible even from a more adept writer. But also, I don't think she's entirely blameless in crafting a patchy character that constantly spouts some of the least funny, cheesiest dialogue I've read in a long time. When the core of your novel is that soulless and that annoying, then you are rather doomed to fail, and fail they have. Nobody expects a novelisation to read like Dickens, but it's not unreasonable to expect more than this paceless montage of better movies, better TV shows, and characters seen and served better elsewhere. I suppose it was rather foolish to expect more given the movie's reputation, but this is the level of shite you'd probably expect if you have seen it. Now I'm off to Blockbuster to rent the movie.